And so with this basic syntax of rules made of selectors and declarations, let's see how the different types of selectors and the way in which we can insert actually the styles into the page. So inserting styles into a page is called the cascading mechanism that relies on different places where you can declare the rules, and every place takes the precedence over the others. The rules, the general rules are quite articulated. I wouldn't say complex, but they're quite articulated. Basically, there are some browser defaults where every element does it as a style, the typical black and white style, the default style, and you already so every property in every element is already being set but to a default value by the browsers, and then you can redefine those styles with an external style like the CSS file that you can link to the page. This is the basic mechanism. You are redefining with external files the default styles coming from the browser. Then if you want, you can also have some styles defined inside the page in the head section, or some inline styles inside the HTML elements. This is what we saw before with the style attribute in HTML that we already agreed that we should try to avoid it as much as possible. Okay, so the basic mechanism is made of these two, and actually of this one, because the other is the default. And it all happens by linking in the head of the document a file, style file, with this instruction. Link connects an external file, this one, to the web page, and it tells the browser that this file should be used as a style sheet, basically. This is the way in which we import into a page a set of styles. So in our example, we are in the head, so we create a new file here, styles, we can call it like you want, and in the HTML file we add a link to with the relationship of style sheet, we are copying this relationship of style sheet type text/css, which is the format of the file, right? And href, reference to the to the control space, to the style.css file. And that's it. In this case, we are loading into our HTML page this styles file. Of course, right now this styles is empty, so the browser doesn't show any difference. If I load it, nothing happens, except that I see that this link is now in the HTML. But just to see if what happens if I apply to the body a style of background color of I don't know, this one, I will remove it more probably. But if I reload by applying this style, if I reload the page in the browser, the background of the page changed. So I'm applying a property to the property is called background color to the element selected by this selector, and the selector is simply body. So this is the basic mechanism. The cascading rules are more complex because we can also have styles declared inside the head with a style element, or inline with a style attribute. We'll try to avoid that. It's better to have them in a clean and separated file. And so there's a lot of complexity here in the cascading rules. Browser styles, user styles. We don't use the user styles are customizations that the user can do to their browsers. Is not very much used. The author styles are what the web developer is doing, and in particular we will be using external styles in separate files. So for all this cascading, basically we are programming our styles here. And more specific rules have the priority over more general rules, and this notion of specificity is quite complex in CSS. Basically means if they relate to a smaller or to a more nested set of elements. It's not a definition, it's just an idea of what it means. If we have some inline styles, they will be applied and they take the priority, but we try to avoid them. And it may also have some important styles. Some styles are marked with an important pseudo value that will take the precedence over the others. So if we want actually to override some behavior. The specificity is, this is a more complete flow chart, but as I said, we try not to rely on those levels of details unless we are building the CSS libraries that other people will use. We'll try to get simple. And as we say, the real goal of today is to have a flavor of what CSS looks like, but then jump into how to use a library that already does most of the dirty work for us. Okay, let's go back to the selectors to be more practical. What kind of selectors do we have? Okay, in the example that we did, we used a very simple selector, which is the element selector. So body, h1, p. The name of an HTML element can be used as a selector, and it will select all the elements in the page with that specific tag name. We may have a class selector, which is a dot plus the class name. And it will match all the elements with that class name of every element type. So for example, in our HTML, we had define a class like important or a highlight, for example. Okay, this highlight class, we can now give it's inside a span, but it could be also inside something else. So maybe I want to apply highlight also to important here. I can define a style matching all the elements dot with class highlight. And in this case, I will set the background color to yellow. Okay, so the browser should honor this request by putting a yellow background to the my scores word. These are in a span. It's an inline element, so it's only part of the paragraph. This information becomes yellow all the line because it's in a h3 element, which is a block level element, so it will take all the white of the line independently on how much context do you have. But you see that the mechanism is just finding the element where I want to apply something and then deciding what to apply, what kind of property I want to override. So the classes are just used very easily with a dot in front of them. So dot means class. Hash sign means ID. So it's the same. If I want to match an element that I mark with an ID, that is selected with an ID, I just use it in a selector, which is the hash, the symbol plus the ID of the element itself. So in our example, we use the ID in the scores table. So I want the scores table to be in blue, for example. And so I just hash scores table. And the property is the color of the text to be blue, navy blue, for example. And if I save this and reload the page, I see that this whole table, because it's inside the div that we have selected with the ID, becomes blue, basically. The text, in this case, I change the color of the text and not the background, and so on. Okay, so everything happens thanks to this link, okay, you can, it's the same that you find in the slides, relationship, style sheet, type, text, CSS, and then finally the name of the file that we have. And we apply elements, classes, and IDs. There are other selectors, like they are more, say, detailed. The attribute selector, so all the elements with a given attribute, all the maybe input elements of type text, these are common, or a pseudo selector, which is a sort of a dynamic interpretation of an element. We'll see some example. Elements Marco can have more than one class. Yes, there's the relationship between elements and classes is many to many. Okay, a class, many elements, an element, many classes. You can do whatever you want. It's the only ID that has the ID as one-to-one mapping. Okay, so these are the simple examples that we saw interactively. The attribute selector may select a group of elements whose attributes have some value, and there are some examples here, but okay, it's the details. I won't go into all the details of the slides, okay, because it will be boring, but you have it there. Pseudo classes are with the colon symbol saying, okay, the link. Whether a link, for example, is just a link or is it a link that has already been visited. You know that when you click on a link on a page, it will change color, so the next time you recognize that it was already visited. The element is still an A, it's still a link, but its status is different, so you can have this status to select different behaviors. And one very important one is the hover element, that will change the state of a pseudo element, that will change the state of an element when you pass the mouse over it. Okay, so when you are over maybe in the table, you may say that when you hover your mouse over an element, the table will highlight, will change color or whatever. So we can say that whenever we have in our score table, whenever we have some cell of the table and we are hovering over it with the mouse, we can maybe change the color to red. Okay, so it will be very ugly to see, but just to understand how it works. So in this case, when I go over a cell with my mouse, not the title, because not a TD, is a TH, and the individual cell will become red. And it's a dynamic class that is applied only when this condition is met. Of course, we can, as Andrea is saying, we could also do this in JavaScript when we come to that, by getting the over event and with JavaScript changing the property. This is for free. If we can do that with style sheets, it's for free, because we don't have to intercept the event, handle it, and register the event handler, and so on. It's always inside the browser. Of course, there are limitations with what you can do in CSS, but what can be done, let's say, for free, I think it's better to get it. Okay, and these different selectors can be combined in different ways. So, for example, you can combine a class, an element, a dot class, a hash ID, and an attribute selector together. So you can mix them, and each of these can be further combined with others, like a union, like a nesting. So S2 is inside S1 somewhere, or S2 is a direct child of S1, or S1 and S2 are at the same level, so they are not nested inside each other, but they come after. So a paragraph after a text, for example, immediately after, or later, so after some time. So you can combine all of these to select, like we discussed before, okay, saying, do we need to put an ID to this my scores? Well, maybe not. We can say that we want to identify my scores as an H1 inside an header. So we can put that like a header containing an H1 will be, I don't know, background color could be, I don't know, this one. It gets uglier and uglier. Okay, so we are selecting an element, a specific element. There is only that one in the page, not by ID, but by, say, describing its position. It will be the only H1 inside the only header element, and so on. So this is basically, we recombine the different selectors. We select different elements and we just apply the attributes to them. So the mechanism is quite simple. The effect, we are a complete table of the different the different types of combination of selectors with other selectors. Like we said, there are some properties that are more important than others. I would like to mention the display property, that will specify whether a given block is inline, a given element will be treated as an inline or a block element. In HTML, we saw that some elements are blocks and some others are inline. Well, we can change it if we want. So we can make a list where the elements run horizontally instead of vertically. So li will change from block, vertical, to inline, horizontal, and so on. So if you want, we can change it. But more interesting, the display property may also have a value none, or there's also another attribute which is called visibility, that may be made hidden, for example. And this means that we can easily make some parts of the page disappear. And the difference between the two is that in this case the element disappears like it's deleted, so other parts of the page will take its space. And in the second case, it will just become invisible, but it will still occupy its space, or that space will be empty in the page. So we want just to flash it or not, or in the other case, we want to make it appear or disappear from the page. So there are very simple mechanisms that where we can maybe in the HTML page prepare maybe some error message somewhere, but we don't want to show it. So in the HTML, we create it, we create the div, we create a block, but then we hide it. And we will show it only when there is some real error to be shown. So we are preparing placeholders to later on inject the real content. So there's basically a strategy where we can use these attributes in the page. If you start browsing the CSS specification, you will spend probably weeks and weeks, because there's a lot of selectors, pseudo classes, maybe something that will select the first letter of a paragraph to make the first letter bigger than the others, or whatever. No? There are many special cases, but they all rely on the same general mechanism. So I'm not going to spend your time with all of this, right? Up to now, we did something very simple. We just changed colors. We didn't really change the layout. We just made an ugly page uglier, I would say. But anyway, we just tried it. We were just testing. If we want to change the layout of the elements, we should reason about the space that every element occupies. And in CSS, there's a very, again, complex method for representing the space taken by an object, and then as a consequence how the objects can relate to each other, okay, how they are distant, they are close, and so on. So basically every object starts with a content which is the actual content of the element. So if we have a table, this will be the space taken by the table. If we have the letter A, this will be the content. We have a box, a rectangular box around the real content. If we have an image, imagine that image inside the box, and so on. So that will be the real content, which is a private space of the element that is needed for displaying that specific content. Then an element may have a border around it, may have 0 pixels, so it's invisible, or maybe may have some width, and so it will be visible. So around an element, I can draw a border, and I can decide the size of this border, thin or thick. And I can decide the color of this border. Okay, I can change it. And we have a measurement about this border. Then we have other two areas that make the distance between the limit of the content and the beginning of the border, which is called the padding. It's a space inside the element to make sure that the border doesn't touch the content. If we want, we may have a padding of 0, so they will touch, or a padding greater than 0, so the border is not just against the element. And we have a margin, which gives a space outside the border so that other elements cannot touch the border if we want. Okay, so we have these three layers around the content: the padding, the border, and the margin. We can set all the three. One of the differences that we should remember is that the padding gets the background of the content, and the margin gets the background of the surrounding content, of the external environment. Okay, so the padding is inside the border, the margin is outside the border. We can play with all of this, and the inspector will show us all these properties, all these numbers, when we select an element in the browser. So maybe when we select this table element here, for example, the table is here, we can see the layout, and the layout will tell us the real size of the content here. We have 0 padding, we have 0 border, but we could have maybe a 1 pixel border. If we want to change it, you can change it in the 4 sizes, and you see that a thin border starts to appear around the table. Of course, the modification that we are doing here in the inspector don't survive, because in the HTML and the CSS we are not modifying anything. Okay, but we can test them, we can test the behavior, and see what happens if we play with these properties. Okay, and so we can also change maybe the color of the border and so on. So, so imagine that every element is nested inside these 3 boxes that are by default of 0 pixel each, except some of them. For example, you see that this my scores, the title here, has a margin of 21 pixels. This is not a margin that I added, it's a margin that was by default in the browser for the H1 elements. Do I like it? I keep it. If I don't want, I just have to redefine this margin, so to reset the default margin for H1 elements, and so on. So all the spacing can be controlled, the line spacing, the spacing between the elements, and so on. The alignment can be controlled through this box model, so-called box model. And through the box model, we have different ways of positioning boxes one close to the other, and so on. I will give you just a short overview of this, because then we'll get to what the Bootstrap library does, because there's a long history of this layout, say, rules for CSS. CSS started with very simple and low-level rules that was very bound to the layout algorithm inside the browser. They were very complex to use. Basically, they were very low level. Basically, every element could modify the layout algorithm with 4 different variants of the algorithm. So in the normal flow, you can position an element by shifting it of a relative position according to the position where it should be, or absolute, shifting it with respect to the corner of the page or the containing element. So the containing element is called absolute, and the border of the page is called fixed. And we have a combination of all these to just take the elements and move them in a different position from where the default layout would put them. Well, we have a Z index that will tell us what is in front and what is in back of the others, and all this is combined. So there are these 3: the layout algorithm, the index, and the floating property. Floating means that an element is not part of the flow, but will float to the left or float to the right. Like when we have an image and you want the text around the image to float around, and so the image will be taken out of the flow of the text, and the text will go around the picture itself. And these were the mechanisms that were used in the first years to create layouts in the page. So, for example, we had okay, there's also a mechanism for stopping the float. It's called clear. I'm running here because we won't use this low-level mechanism anymore. Okay, but just to tell you that there were mechanisms for taking a page and trying to create a layout of a page by setting that, for example, the left sidebar will be a float left element, the right sidebar will be a float right element, and the main content will also be a float left, but will be after the first one, and so we'll take all the remaining space and so on. So there was a lot of tricks and templates that will allow you to lay out a page, to create the main types of layout of pages using floats and margins, basically. Okay, margins, sizes, and so on. And also to answer to Pietro, all of these margins, borders, sizes, and so on can be set uniformly, or can be set differently for every corner, for every side. Okay, so for example, we could have a 0 margin here, but a sort of a gutter is called maybe a 10 pixel margin to keep the two separated, to give a little margin. So the left and right margin could be different depending also the border also. So you can control everything. Maybe too much, I would say. Okay, so there were tricks for doing that, and people really climbed a very high ladder to create complex layouts. Here we have some examples of the layout that we see and the complexity that they have inside. Fortunately, we have now much simpler ways of laying out pages. I would just mention you two that will be used in our Bootstrap library. The first one is grids. So most of the pages align elements or organize elements according to a virtual grid of content. So, for example, this page actually has been laid out with a 4-column grid, 4 column by 3 rows, where some elements only occupy one cell, like this one here, 1 by 1, and some elements occupy 2 cells, or maybe also the full row if you want, and so on. So we don't need to reason about pixels or the spacing or the alignment and so on. We have a grid, and we say, okay, in the first row, the grid will be, in this case, of 4 columns. In the first row, this element will take 2 columns, this element will take 1, and the other will take 1. 2 plus 1 plus 1 is 4. We fill the row and go to the next one, and so on. And so it's a very high-level mechanism to decide what goes in a row and goes below. We can have grids with the same column width. We can, in this case, the 4 columns have equal width, but we can also have grids where the width of the columns is different to make maybe space, to make room for different type of elements. So it's easier to use than floating left and floating right, and because the different floats have by default different heights, so when they combine together they may go below or go besides, and well, you have a very interesting set of bugs that people, developers, struggle for 10 years or more. Right now we have this easier way. It's very easy to define a grid. You just have to declare that one div is a grid. You can define it by giving a number of columns and rows, so you define the size of the grid, and you can also have elements that span multiple columns or so on, and the element just position themselves. If there's no space, more space on a row, they will just shift to the next row. So you don't have to declare. It's not like a table when you're very rigid about rows and columns. You say, this is a grid, this is an element that will take 2 columns, so I will take the next 2 ones. If there are no 2 columns left, I will just go to the next row, and it all happens automatically. for example, the main page of the main structure of the page, it's much more flexible than a table. Don't confuse it with table that we use just to position numbers. It's just for big containers. So, for example, the header, nav, and so on in a big section can be seen as a grid. You see, 3 rows but 3 columns, and you can just define like that. Okay, the section, which is the container, will display grid. Display grid means that inside this section, the layout algorithm will be grid layout, and you declare the size of the columns, 150 pixels for the left one, 200 for the right one, and all the rest is an expanding measure. Everything else, so you will fill all the page. And the same for the rows, a fixed size for the header, fixed size for the footer, and everything else for the body. So we are an elastic sort of a grid. And when we have the different header, nav, and so on, we just position them in which grid, row, and column we want to position them. So we are positioning them manually. If we don't that, they will just take their space in the next free grid element. Marco, is what you are saying is the responsiveness that is a consequence of grids, not just the grid themselves, but we'll see in a second what we need to do when we want to reflow the image. Right now we can resize the content. Okay. With this elastic measure, this content will be narrower or wider, but we still have 3 columns. In the next step, we'll see how to make one column disappear or to be in top instead of on the side, depending on the size of the screen. Okay, so again, if we want to apply by hand grid layouts, I have some reference here that you can see. There's also a step further over grids, which is a more recent standard in CSS, which goes Flexbox, which goes a step further, because it's an alternative to grids. So if you want, you can apply a grid layout. If you want, you can apply a so-called flex layout. And a flex layout gives some rules about how the elements are aligned inside a container, and these rules are quite general and quite powerful, and then the element will position themselves. And we have 4 basic properties for a flex, sorry. Whether the element will align to left or right border, whether the flex will be horizontal or vertical. We just change a property, and then everything will be rerouted in vertical or horizontal way. The order of the elements, so which come first, and the size. You see that this element in the center and then becomes in the right, so we can reorder them, giving an order 1, 2, 3. It may be different from the order of appearance in the HTML, and then the size. So by default, all the elements of a flex will get the same size, but you can say that this one should be twice larger than the others if you want, and then everything will be computed dynamically. Grids and flexbox are nowadays, yes, they're supported by all major browsers. So if you go to major browsers, you don't have big problems, except maybe for some details or some bugs, but now is the standard way. Okay, people tend to develop these pages in this way because it's much more flexible. And how to use a flex is similar to the grid. You have a container, and you say that this container should, you change the layout algorithm of this container. Say, okay, display flex. Inside this container, the rules for the layout are no longer block or inline or whatever, there are flex. And so we apply these rules. And every child, direct child of this element will be a flex item. Okay, so they are direct child. So I have a section or a div with inside some other divs. So all these divs are treated as one block that need to be laid out into the external flex container. Inside the box, we can have other content that is not inside this box. The default algorithm still applies. So it's only on one level deep, so it doesn't propagate. Okay, yeah, we have some examples, but again, you see that the rules are set on the container here. So we say we are changing the layout algorithm also with this display property, which is very powerful. You see that changing the display will completely change the layout algorithm that will be applied to every element inside that. And then we give the properties of this algorithm. So okay, all the elements should be centered. I want the spacing to be equal on all the sides, or I want the spacing to be only between the elements with no spaces on the side. Many details. I want to wrap the text when I get to the border, or I will let the text overflow. Yes or no? So this is another property. So all these properties are set on the container, and always they start with display flex. On the element, you don't need to specify any special property because it's all the container that does the work, and this is also nice. In the grid, you have to tell each element in the grid where to position itself and so on. In the flexor, you just have to describe the algorithm to the container, and then the elements will position themselves. Okay, how to deal with the spacing, what is the direction. So all the details that we saw in the first picture here are taken by this flex direction property and so on. Again, I'm giving you just a hint because all this flex algorithm is what it will be actually used in Bootstrap. Okay, so we will see with the actual attributes given by the library. They are called flexible because the size of the elements is computed automatically by the algorithm. So we can have whether the element keep their size or whether they will be stretched to occupy the available space in an equal way or with different weights. Okay, so with these rules, again, these are basic rules. So you can combine them. You can get basically all the layouts you want. Here you have some example where you decided that you give the flex attribute to the item, say okay, they will have weight 1 and the other one has weight 2, and so we occupy twice the space. So if you want to customize them, it's the only case when you need to specify some property on the children. Otherwise, all the algorithms on the container. Okay. As I said, flexes work only one level deep. So if you have one div, for example, that contains two other elements, A and B, inside this block, the flex doesn't work. It's not applied. So they are dealt as one element and another element that need to be laid out according to the rule. So inside each of them, each block, you can do whatever you want, basically. Okay, so we have a handful of properties that you may have the layout with the say floats, or with grids, or with flex. Each of them has their own set of attributes, and they have a different say complexity of difficulty of usage. Okay, so if you want to learn more, you can go there, but I will add a last ingredient and then see the solution to all of this problem. Okay, so most of the cases we are not using these attributes directly, but we're using them through the library. The last step is responsive design. So what happens when you don't know the size of the screen? So a website may be shown on the desktop computer or on a smartphone, and the layout is different, will change, and we want it to change automatically, of course giving some rules, some criteria for updating. And this is enabled thanks to a mechanism called media queries in CSS. Media query is a different type of selector that will select or will enable some rules only if some condition related to the media, so to the page, applies. So in this case, we have a rule, a set of declaration with its own selector, with its own property, one or more rules that will be applied only if the screen is at least 900 pixels wide. Otherwise, the rules will not be applied, will just be deleted. So we may have different rules that are applied to different according to the size of the window. So I can have one with the minimum height is 19 and the other where the maximum height is 900, sorry, and they will be applied and I will apply one set or another set of rules according to the size of the device. And so it's very, very powerful, but it's also very detailed because you need to be sure that you don't leave anything out and you get all the combination of height and height of the device and so on. But this is the basic mechanism, let's say it's called the assembly language of responsive design. Being able to create conditional rules whose condition depends on some property of the container, of the window, basically, of the browser. Okay, so we can turn on or off some rules according to the type or the size of the web page where they are applied. And so according to these rules, we can change the rule of flex or we can change the rule of grid, because we are actually using different rules and the same content, the same HTML. Let's go back to the beginning of this morning. The same HTML will be laid out in a very different way, with side-by-side elements or with everything vertical, depending on the size. So we can set up these rules. Doing that by hand is quite complex, and so in many cases the designers came up with a compromise, with an easy compromise, which mixes say the concept of media queries with the grids. Usually when you lay out a page, you rarely care about the pixels. You care about the big organization of the page. So it's a good choice, for example, to start with a grid, with a fixed grid of columns, and try to use the space, to distribute the space of your content across these different columns. And then you decide what is the minimum, for example, size of the browser window that will allow you to still keep that column, or to make it disappear, or to move it above or below. Okay, all of this combination is what the Bootstrap library is already doing for you. So Bootstrap will mix flex layout and media queries, and will give you a huge set of CSS classes that you can tag to your elements and apply the layout algorithms to them. So all the concepts that we have really rushed through, so I just give you some hints about what is happening there, are already implemented in an organic way with no bugs, basically, inside this framework, Bootstrap. And so we will develop, there are 4 or 5 major CSS frameworks. We will be using Bootstrap in this course, just as an example of many of them, but they all work in a similar way. So what does Bootstrap do? It updates the visual aspect of the browser. It updates the fonts and the spacing to something which is more modern. It applies a grid-based layout internally based on the flex box, and it allows you to transform various elements and to apply a responsive layout by declaring the minimum height or the relative height of the columns and the minimum height of the screen to display a column, all just by applying classes to your containers. Okay, so let's try to see that. We have a lot of classes. Every class applies one specific effect, and we can combine many classes in the same element to get the result that we want. There are some basic classes for colors, basic layouts, and we have a lot of other components that will create already the menu, the navigation bar, a list, an accordion, some basic interface elements. And it's been designed from scratch to be responsive, so it's automatically responsive in your page. How to use it? It's quite easy. So if we go to Get Bootstrap, which is the website of the Bootstrap library, just beware, it will propose you to work with the version 5 beta. Let's go back to the version 4.6. First, because it's more stable and more documented, and secondly, because when we go to React, we have a React Bootstrap library that still supports only version 4. Okay, so be aware that we want to use version 4, not version 5 of Bootstrap. Otherwise, we will have a problem later when we try to insert that into React. Okay, how to load the CSS framework into our page is very easy. We just have to load the CSS style sheet here from this page and put that into our code, into our heading. So maybe let's delete this style sheet, which is very ugly, and instead we insert this link that I take. In this case, the Bootstrap library is just a CSS file, as you see. It's being loaded from the network. You can also download it into your computer and load it from there, but if you are connected to the internet, it may be also faster, okay, to just download the latest version from the network for their servers. And plus, for working, CSS also needs a little bit of JavaScript. Okay, so it requires you to load these two JavaScript scripts. It's something that we will learn to do later, but right now just copy and paste without thinking these two lines before the end of the body. So the rule, then we'll understand why. Okay, but for now, just trust the instructions. We put these two script codes before the end of the body. So we added 3 lines to our document, and I deleted the link to my previous style sheet, right? And with these 3 lines modified, our application already changed a bit. So I removed the ugly colors, and you see the fonts and the spacing is more modern looking. It's not already a nice complete page, but it looks a bit better. Now we start applying classes defined by the Bootstrap library to our parts of the page. Okay, so we are not writing the CSS, basically. We are writing classes into the HTML that will link to the Bootstrap rules, basically. We'll apply the Bootstrap styles. And if you want, it's better. If you want, also there's this template that already gives you a page, for example, with this line here, that will enable the responsiveness of the viewport of the browser. So it's better also to add it. So if we hadn't started from an already existing file, we could just start from this initial page, okay, in Bootstrap. So let me add this also link declaration here. Okay. Okay. Right now we see that the browser has redefined some styles of the Bootstrap has redefined some styles of the browser. If we were to use Bootstrap 2 npm, how would the browser handle with render a page as opposed to using Node? We will come to that later when but at that point we will have to run a web browser instead inside our application. Right now we are just loading files. Okay, later on we will combine a Node as a server, and so there are a lot of small pieces to fit together. You could use npm to download it, then you have to serve it to put it in a location where it will be served by the browser. Is it a problem to put the 2 script links in the header? It's not a problem, it's a performance issue. We will discuss it also when we see how to insert the JavaScript. If we put it in at the end, then the loading of the script doesn't block the loading of the page. But again, I'm sorry, but at this point I have to ask you to trust okay, the recipe for going forward, and then we'll come to the different pieces in time, and we'll try to understand why we are doing that, right? Alfredo, we should put many conditions for the same header, for example, for different users, even with Bootstrap. I don't understand. For different users, you mean for the different type of browsers? Okay, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Okay, Alfredo. Bootstrap is doing all the work for us. Okay. Let's see how. First of all, let's go to the quick introduction about Bootstrap, and it will tell you basically that where is that? Layout. For Bootstrap to work and to give to Bootstrap the control over the layout of your page, you should wrap everything, the main content of your page, inside a container element. We have two different types of containers. One is just called container, and the other is container fluid, which is they behave differently. Container gives a different fixed weight that depends on the size of the browser, and container fluid will always occupy 100% of the browser window. So it depends on what you want to do. Here is talking about responsive breakpoints. What do they mean? It means that Bootstrap defines 5 different sizes of the screen: extra small, small, medium, large, and extra large, with this number of pixels. This is predefined by them. We don't need to care about them. If you want something to apply to small screens, or to medium screens, or to large screens, you just have to use these attributes: small, medium, large, extra large, or fluid. These couple of letters, extra small, small, medium, large, can be appended to many classes. So for the container, it's easy. So let's say you want to occupy the whole page. Okay, so we just take the scores, which is the biggest component. I don't have a component that gets everything, that contains everything, so let's just add one: div class container fluid, because I didn't have any container that contained all my application. And so we apply the container. We wrapped all my code into a container fluid class, and if I reload it, the margin has already changed a bit. So I get a nice margin here, while before I didn't have one. And then I can, let's go forward with Bootstrap here. Okay, I can use the grid for deciding how much space every element will take on the screen. So if I don't say anything, I will get all the space in the page. Otherwise, I will get some column. So the idea is that inside a container, I can define rows and columns just by adding classes. So I have a row that will contain some contents. I declare the container with the class row. Inside this row may have different columns. In this case, a column small means that they will display on the small size and larger sizes. This is the minimum size that we want to display this as a column instead of as a block inside of that. We have the rules here where we can apply the different options. Say all the prefixes, column, and it will apply for every size. This will apply only if you have at least 550 pixels. Medium will apply this rule if you have at least 72 pixels, and so on. And so it will create a column. Otherwise, it will create a block. In this case. And also I can specify by default the columns have the same width. So column and column will divide. If you have 2 of them in the same row, they will divide the space evenly. If I have 3 in the same row, they divide the space in 3. But if I want to have a different size, I can specify, for example, a column to occupy 6 spaces, 6 grid spaces. Bootstrap works with a 12 column layout. So 12 can be divided in 6 and 6. 4 and 8, 3 and 9, 3, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4, 4, and so on. So it's a nice number to divide. Okay. So for example, we may have something like this layout, 1/3, 2/3, and saying that okay, the header has its own row. Okay, so I can class row. It's a Bootstrap row, and then we have the main content that contains the aside and the main. So I may add a new row. Okay, around my two main pieces of content here and there. So from the structure point of view, I have, let me collapse it. I have the container with a header, with a row which is a container, and the second row they just did, that contains the aside that we may declare that there's a column of 3 occupying 3 grid spaces, and the main that will occupy column 9. Okay, the column classes can only be inside an element with a row class, and the row can only be inside a container. Okay, and if we do this magically, I hope, the main content goes in the center right of the page, and the side information goes to the left. There's something wrong with the statistics here, of course. Yes, there's also there are many classes. For example, col means a column choose your white, so it takes the white that it needs. If I specify a number, I give the proportion. If I specify a media size, small and medium large, I'm specifying at which size it will appear, will break, and so on. Okay, Carlo, the number after the call is the number of virtual columns that we are taking. So every row is composed of 12 spaces. 12. It's a grid with 12 columns. We are saying that we are giving the proportion. 3/12 are for the aside, and 9/12 are for the main. Okay, so the 12 virtual columns are allocated 3 for the aside and 9 for the main. So the total would be 12. And we see that we already have some responsive behavior, because if we shrink it, no, not yet, sorry, because I didn't give the information about column. Let's check. Reload. Okay, if I'm saying that this column at least requires the small size, not the extra small, I see that if when the size goes below the threshold, the column is not a column anymore, and so it will take its own space. So the media query will just say, disable the flex and say, okay, this is no longer an inline block, it's a flex block, it's a new block, and it goes below. And you decide which is the size in which you want this effect to happen. Can be small or can be medium, for example, and so it will probably be triggered before. No, yeah, it's no, it's not working, sorry. Okay, there's a lot of filling. We can also have column small 3 here. There's a combination. We need of course to study the rules, but the basic mechanism is that just by applying, you see the same here, just by applying these classes, we have revolutionized the layout of the page. Containers, I don't think they can be nested. No, you can close one container and open another one, and will create a new grid environment, because the container defines the grid basically. We are not seeing Luca, we are not seeing SAS during the course. We already have enough content and enough languages to study, so You are free to use it if you want, but we are not. We don't have space and time to discuss that. Okay. Okay, Alessandro, is there a verifier for CSS or Bootstrap as is there for XML? For CSS, yes, there is a CSS validator. Just search CSS validator on Google, you get one. Not and for Bootstrap, not that I know. Okay, let me maybe add some other classes. For example, the table. We have a table, class equal to table. And we'll also start to lay out the table in a nicer way with fonts and with alignments and with spacing and so on. And you see all these attributes in the Bootstrap documentation. Where is that? Okay. In the Bootstrap documentation, basically in the layout section, you have the rules for exploiting the grids. Okay, so the overview will give you the algorithm, where are these responsive breakpoints, but basically all the algorithm that is used. The grid, how it works, is the most important part. If you want to learn the algorithm, is in this bullet list. What criteria they use. But the nice part is that we have a lot of examples down there. A lot of examples where we can also try them, see what happens with different sizes. For example, this column will shrink and that will not jump because they are not responsive. Okay, in other cases, you see, if you have how to set one content to occupy all the space, and then we come down to the responsive part, where you see, for example, these 4 elements. If I shrink the browser at a given point, that we start. Sorry. We start dropping down. Come on. Here, sorry, because this one will only shrink because we didn't specify any breakpoint, small, medium, large. If I specify a breakpoint, then it will be sorry, it flashes because also it's responsive also on the main page. So you can see that they are one on side of the other, and if I reduce them, they are one below the other, and so on. So basically what you are saying is, the bottom line is, I want to have the proportion, the percentage of the different parts of the page occupied. And the minimum size of the window where I would like to see this in different columns. Below that size, there will be they will have a vertical layout. Above this side, there will be on one side of the other, and we'll have this proportional size. And of course, the combinations are infinite, but the rules are quite easy. Apart from the layout rules, we also have some content. If you explore this page here, you find everything. Like, for example, okay, it will change the code and so on. How to format tables. You have to just add a class table. You can add, well, in this case, the scope are not very used, but you can, change the style of the tables, change the styles of some rows, and so we have a lot of examples. For example, for tables. Utilities are a lot of classes, maybe for setting colors of the text, colors of the links, colors of the background, and so on. And so you just declare the color of the background, the colors of the text, and it will apply to the class that you want. If you want, you may have more control over the flex behavior with classes, okay, but it's rarely the case. So into utilities, basically you have the information for changing the colors, the display, of the different elements, not with the basic CSS property, but with classes that already take into account responsiveness and cross-browser compatibility. And then, for example, the text is the paragraphs. You can align paragraphs quite easily, much easier than setting a style, basically. And then, last point, I want to show you the components part. When you already have many, say, user interface components like buttons, for example, of different colors, you just describe them with a specific class. It's a button with a primary color, and so on. You can have a button group, for example. They're already laid out with the borders, with the rounded corners, and so on. You just have to define that the container is a button group that contains buttons where you specify the colors and so on. So there are a lot of details here that help you to think of the page in terms of components. What do you want in the component? This one. Okay, the HTML is simple because they're just container, and at the end I have a button, which is a basic HTML element, and all the style, all the spacing, all the colors, all the fonts is being already taken care of by Bootstrap. You may like it or not, this style, but at least it's consistent, it's clean, it's modern. You can also customize it. You can download some different layouts and styles for Bootstrap, but let's start simple. Okay, I suggest starting simple. A couple of questions is, Christian, can we merge different frameworks in the same page? I would suggest not to try to do that. Choose one framework and then use the extensions that are compatible with that framework. For example, for Bootstrap, we have a set of icons, a set of themes that are compatible with that. But other frameworks also have some ecosystem. If you try to merge them, they will most likely conflict over even the basic issues like the font size or the font type. Alessandro, in the end, we won't have a CSS file, but we have the, okay. Basically, right now, we don't have, there are two questions in one. One is we don't have any longer our own CSS file, but basically we could have it. I deleted it. I'm not calling it because it was ugly. But if I want to modify, to add some my personal styles, of course, I can add a second link to load my own personal styles that will override those specified by Bootstrap. So I can have one, but in many cases, I don't need. I'm already specifying in the HTML not the detailed style, but at least the role or the rules of the criteria for layout to apply to that specific element. For example, for the buttons, as we saw before, we have what is that? Oh, it was here. Sorry. The buttons are called, the colors of the button are not called blue, gray, and green. They're called primary, secondary, success. So it's in a way they are semantic classes that have a predefined visual layout. If you are applying a different Bootstrap theme, the primary and secondary colors will be different. You will still call them primary and secondary, not blue and gray, but you are trying to define the role that a given element in the user interface has in a consistent way as much as possible. It will also help a lot with consistency. So in this case, we are yes, I agree with Alessio and also Alessandro that we will be working mostly in the HTML by first of all defining the layout and then defining the styles of the element. If we are using Bootstrap, we are just adding classes to the HTML. We will be writing very few CSS except for modifying or for specifying some detail more. And so we can do that in our own styles file. We need to understand the mechanism, of course, because otherwise putting these classes it will be just magic. And if we want, we can extend it or modify it and redefine it. And also one detail, when we are also using JavaScript in the browser, these classes can be dynamically changed. So imagine changing with one instruction, one class on an element, and Bootstrap will change completely the layout of your application. So that will be very powerful. So we are starting, just imagine these classes as the, say, starting point, the default state of your page that can be later modified by the code. So it's very powerful. And it's we don't need to, basically, that's why I was very quick in the overview of the CSS rules. A simple language with a very complex set of properties. Let's shrink it down, let's choose a library, and if you want to become a visual designer, then you need, of course, to dig into the CSS and try to understand all the tricks. Otherwise, our focus is more on trying to develop the application without losing our sane mind in the layout issues. So we will use a library just to help us get out of the complexity of the CSS. So what we are trying to do in the next lab in Monday is more or less what we did today, but more, say, a bit more complex, a bit more complete, to create a skeleton page in HTML with Bootstrap that will give you the desired layout and content for an example of the to-do list or the task list that we did in the previous part. So we are just working on the layout, no JavaScript, no code, just HTML and Bootstrap, and maybe a little bit of CSS. In the week later, we'll try to put the two together, of course. Will still normal, yes, it will be still a normal lab. It's not yet part of the big labs. The big lab will start after the Easter vacations, okay, in the weeks after the Easter vacation. So it's just for training, yeah, still. Okay, so thank you for being with me also today. If you have any questions, you know where to find me on Slack, and have a nice day to everybody. Bye bye.